Welcome. What a powerful movie. I so enjoy. I must have watched this about 10 times. I'm Phyllis Chang, and I am a mediator at ADR Services, former director of the Department of Fair Employment and Housing, and a former partner at DLA Piper. I am so honored to be moderating today's event. I want to thank the Alameda County Bar Association and Women Lawyers of Alameda County for sponsoring this event. Want to thank our phenomenal director, Yugu, director and producer, and Elizabeth I, producer and writer, for putting together this compelling movie. Want to thank Lacey T, former Raiderette, who starred in the documentary, and Maria P, former Buffalo Jill, who also starred. This film has won many awards, including a world premiere at Tribeca Film Festival and many other international and national film festivals, deservedly. I'd like to introduce the fantastic law firm, Levy, Vinnick, Burrell, and Hyams, that made the lawsuit possible and prevailed in helping Lacey T, the lead cheerleader against the NFL. So Leslie Levy, Sharon Vinnick, and Darcy Burrell. Very, very nice honor to be on this discussion with you. So please tell me, how did your firm come to represent Lacey and the other cheerleaders?
Well, through our network of attorneys, we were contacted by Lacey and her husband, who sent us a copy of the cheerleader handbook and the contract and asked us if we were interested in talking to them. I, immediately took a look at the documents, and as we say in the movie, I was completely shocked at what we saw in the documents. So we invited Lacey and her husband Josh to come into the office to talk to us about what we saw in the documents. Now, this was before the cheer season had actually started. So it was during the summer before the first game. And we talked to Lacey about the contract and what we thought was legal and what we thought was illegal and what we thought the results were going to be of her going forward with the lawsuit. And she decided that she had worked so hard to become a cheerleader for the NFL. She wanted to continue with the season and cheer, and that over the course of the season, she was going to make a decision about whether to proceed with the lawsuit. So that's what we did. We kept checking in with her over the course of the season. She considered what she wanted to do. She kept some fantastic records, which was very helpful when we actually did the lawsuit. And then by, I would say, late November, she had decided that she definitely wanted to proceed with the lawsuit.
Right.
She also had we did have another plaintiff in the case who was much more kind of under the radar, but she was important as well.
Why was the contract so one-sided? I mean, tell us about what contracts these teams entered into with the women.
Darcy, you want
to? Well, so I can really only talk about the one that the Raiders had, and it was an amazing contract. Well, they obviously the football team had a lot of power, and that was obvious from looking at the contract. I think after we met with Lacey, I had anticipated that what we would have to argue about was that they were independent contractors, but in fact, the contract said they were employees, and yet it laid out, really, the contract itself laid out all the violations, the wage and hour violations. So it really was an example, or just evidence of how much power the team had. And I think because these women wanted very much to be cheerleaders, and they were willing to sign these, and some of them may not have known any better. They may not have known that the provisions weren't legal. But I think certainly it was that they wanted to be cheerleaders, and they're told, if you don't want to do it, there are a bunch of other women who will do it. And so they don't think they have a choice, even if they know, I think, Lacey obviously knew it was wrong. And I'm sure some of them felt that it wasn't right that they weren't getting compensated for their time, but I think it was really clear to them that you sign this contract or you don't do this. And they were willing to make that choice.
We have two questions from the audience. One is, what made the contracts illegal? Even if the cheerleaders signed it, the contract is illegal under California law? That was a question.
Yes, so the contracts, I mean, you can't, under California law, waive your right to some of the protections under the California wage and hour laws, right? So you can't sign a contract that says, putting aside unions, they have special rules, but generally you're entitled to be paid minimum wage. You're entitled to be paid for all the hours that you work. If you're, not an exempt employee, you are entitled to be reimbursed for expenses that you incur to do your job. Like you're entitled to all those things. If you're an employee, you're entitled to be paid overtime and to get rest breaks. There are a bunch of legal protections that you get. And an employer can't just say, here's sign a contract that says that you're not going to get it, with very few exceptions. And even when there are exceptions, it's very straight, it's very strict in terms of what you have to do in order to be exempted from particular provisions. So the fact that they had signed a contract saying how they were going to be paid and all of these other provisions, that didn't change the fact that they were still employees under California law and were still entitled to those protections.
And
I guess there was strong arbitration. Sorry, Leslie, go ahead.
I would just add one thing to Darcy when she was talking about power. It's power and arrogance. The incredible arrogance that they could put blatantly illegal provisions in writing and assume correctly for decades that nobody would challenge them.
What about the arbitration provision? Doesn't it allow the NFL to actually decide on the outcome?
Essentially, well, it didn't necessarily, not explicitly, but it provided that it would be arbitrated. The arbitrator would be, I can't remember if it was either selected, I think selected by or arbitrated by.
Arbitrated or by at his designation.
Right, the president of the NFL. And so it gave them, I mean, that was one of the other obviously really amazing aspects of the contract. So not only did it deprive them of their rights under the law, if they were to try to bring some kind of action under the contract, it would be decided by, I mean, at that time, by Roger Goodell, and which was obviously incredibly problematic to have somebody who connected with the NFL being the person that makes the decision over whether or not they're violating the laws or whether or not the contract is being violated or anything like that.
One thing is, though, and this was something we've struggled with a lot, is whereas with the Buffalo Gills had Goodell's signature on a contract, we didn't. We had the Raiders, and we struggled trying to find some legal hook to go after the NFL because they knew all about it, they benefited from it, all of this stuff, and we unfortunately, putting our heads together and everybody else we could think of, couldn't come up with a way to actually hook in the NFL on our case. So I was very glad that they were able to do so in Buffalo.
Why is it that you were able to achieve settlement in your case, but the Buffalo Bills case is still ongoing? What's the difference?
Well, I think there were a couple of reasons. First of all, I think that the Raiders, they had a better attitude towards the whole thing, which is that they thought that settlement was going to be, from a public relations perspective, I presume, in their best interest. The Bills, I mean, they not only have the Bills not settled, and there's a bunch of reasons for that having to do with changes in ownership and a bankruptcy proceeding, but the Bills' response to the lawsuit was to cancel having the cheerleaders at all. Okay, so they had this really punitive way of approaching the whole thing. That didn't happen in the Raiders. The Raiders continued to have the Raiderettes and continue to try to find a way to settle it. I mean, within very short order of our filing the lawsuit, there were settlement discussions within a few months. So we filed the case in January, and there was a settlement that went before the Superior Court by August.
I think the Bills are kind of an outlier. I mean, we also represented with East Coast Council, the New York Jets cheerleaders, and that case settled rather quickly as well.
There were also cases against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and the Cincinnati Bengals, and those cases also settled. The only one that did not settle was the one against the Bills.
Well, I was very impressed by the two women who were featured in the documentary. It showed both Lacey and Maria as young girls aspiring to become cheerleaders. It took so much determination and effort and practice, and for them to rise above their humble beginnings. One common element that I saw was the encouragement of support by their mothers. How important do you think that parental maternal support was in achieving the women's goals and being strong enough to fight the system?
I think it was important that they had their family support and their mothers in particular. I think they were both brought up to stand up for what they thought was right. And I do want to say, it's a little off what you were asking, Phyllis, but I want to say that I entered this case with a lot of stereotypes about cheerleaders, about who they are, about why they do what they do. And Lacey taught me a lot. And one of the things Lacey taught me, even though I still have some issues about cheerleaders and circumstances, but she taught me is there's hardly any place that women get to be both dancers and athletes. And this is one of the few arenas in which that happens, and that it took an exhausting amount of work to get there and to maintain it and to do it. So I think that their mother support had a lot to do with them doing the right thing.
We have another question. The question is, how did you work around the arbitration provision to make this case come to light publicly?
Well, one of the things that we were able to do is we felt that the arbitration provision itself was susceptible to attack. I mean, it had all kinds of restrictions in it, including this restriction that Darcy talked about, that Goodell was, or his designee was going to be the one who was deciding the case. So, I mean, that was an easy one to go public with it. And, you know, in most cases, you can file a public lawsuit, you might end up getting compelled to arbitration, but the whole question as to whether or not the case was ultimately going to end up in arbitration was not a clear one based upon the language of the agreement and also where the law was at that moment in time.
And then the audience also has another question. What is the argument? I guess, what are the teams or the Raiders' argument for not paying the cheerleaders a minimum wage?
There wasn't one.
I don't think that happened. I mean, that was one of the things that was the most remarkable about the contract, that they'd said, you know, in a lot of wage and hour cases, you're having to argue about whether they're independent contractors, right? And so employers would classify workers as independent contractors so they don't have to pay them overtime, and they're not, you know, the employees wouldn't be subject to those laws. And that was one of the most amazing things about the contract, is that it explicitly said that they were employees, and yet then purported to not apply any of those laws to them. So they didn't really have an argument. And I don't think they really tried to make one either, honestly.
Well, you know, there were people in the documentary who made comments, like Roger Goodell said, who has paid $200 million, said, we're like a microcosm of society. And then various other people said, oh, well, women's jobs are just paid less. It's women's roles historically to sacrifice their careers for their families. Do you think this is kind of some of the origins of why the women were not even being paid minimum wage?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, it was interesting. One of the things that I found most compelling from working on the case and also from the movie is, you know, the times change. This happened at a moment in history where times were also quickly changing. So when we first started working with Lacey and she was interviewed by reporters, reporters asked her repeatedly if she was a feminist. And she said no, okay, more than once. And I have to say that as her attorneys, we would go back to the office and go, oh gosh, why does she say that? But, you know, over time, as she learned more about what it means to be feminist, and as society started looking at things differently, like a lot of stuff came out, not just the Me Too movement, but things came out with the football, you know, the NFL and all the domestic violence and the abuse. So I think that, you know, partly there was just a whole change of what was going on at the scene. But I think we have, you know, huge societal issues that are just reflected in the NFL about the treatment of women.
And then there were, we also have a comment from the chat in the film, and that is, you know, there's a lot of discussion about cheerleaders doing demeaning work, that they were really selling their bodies, or it's a kind of, you know, selling their work through a sex. Very demeaning, when in fact it's really a highly trained job. Do you think that makes it more, that was one of the obstacles to their compensation?
Well, I think the fact that, I mean, it does take a lot of training. And I think the fact that what went hand in hand in that training and hand in hand with where you could go with that kind of athleticism combined with dance was a place where you had to wear these scanty outfits, and all of this is a reflection of the sexism in our society, that that's how they wanted the women to be seen. And it is part of the reason that they demeaned them, and it is part of the reason that they didn't pay them. And there were provisions in that contract that I wish we could have gone after, about the makeup and the hairstyle and the this and the that. The other thing, and there wasn't a legal basis that we could find. And I think, you know, as I said, I still have some issues about cheerleading, but I have, and the other thing I think we saw, which was in the movie, was the kind of sisterhood that gets created within the team that's really valuable. And there are very, very, very few places that women have that network, where they actually help each other. They develop businesses together. They do all these things. And the sad thing is, there aren't very many places where women can do that. And it was a lot for these women to give up that potential lifetime interaction and support to do this. And I think the fact that there aren't places for women to do that is a reflection of the sexism in our society.
Yeah, speaking of sisterhood, I really noticed that in the, when they have their annual get-togethers, that generations of cheerleaders really bonded with one another, and that meant everything to them to have had this life experience, to have had this career. But then it also cut the other way, didn't it? About half of the people who could have been part of the class opted out of the class because they felt somehow it was a betrayal of the sisterhood, or was unfair to Stephanie, the woman who recruited them to do this work. And then being ostracized by the sisterhood, the named plaintiffs being ostracized. That must have been so difficult. It really required a lot of determination for them to keep going, to fight the system.
So what happened in the Bills case is different than what happened in the Raiders case and the Jets case.
Okay.
So in the Raiders case and the Jets case, virtually all of the women remained in the class. So I think that in the Raiders case, we lost, I don't know, 3 or 4 out of 99. And in the Jets, we didn't lose any. So at the end up, the women took the money. Now, some of the women told me, because I was just on a mission to make sure that the women cashed their checks, that they were going to donate the money. Okay, but those women took the money. That was different than what happened in the bills. But the ostracism, that was real. I mean, on the day that we filed the lawsuit, I mean, we knew that this was going to be a big deal and that we were going to have a lot of reporters who were interested. So we arranged for Lacey to come to our office and spend the day with us. And on the day that the lawsuit was filed, she got so many like mean and nasty emails and texts that at some point we took her phone away from her because she was just getting so upset. And over the course of time, she continued to get, you know, these nasty grams. But her response over time was like, if that's the sisterhood, I don't want to be any part of it. Okay, I want to be part of a sisterhood that'll stand up for each other, not one that's going to tear each other down. So, I mean, it was a little different for us than it was for other people, but it was devastating for Lacey. And all of the women that she became friends with, she didn't stay friends with them. And for our second plaintiff, who's not in the film, she had been a cheerleader for 4 seasons. And by the time she was done standing up, nobody would talk to her anymore.
Wow.
It was terrible.
Now, did your lawsuit spark the legislative efforts by then Assembly Member Loretta Gonzalez?
Yeah, they did. I mean, our lawsuit sparked that, and it sparked the lawsuits across the country. It was kind of like this little rollout that just kept going.
So Loretta Gonzalez in 2015 sponsored 2 pieces of legislation that were signed into law. AB 949, which made cheerleading a competitive sport, and then AB 202, which required California-based professional sports teams to treat cheerleaders as employees for the first time. So have you seen a difference since these bills were signed into law? It's been, well, it will be the 6th year this year, right? It's been 5 years.
You know, I mean, we haven't gotten further complaints about this. And I don't know if that means because they're now all being treated in accordance with the law, or the people who complained, and I mean, we heard from other teams, okay? There are plenty of other teams in the state of California that were not following the law. But there's a big gap between hearing from a woman and their being willing to step forward and championing these lawsuits. So even though we talked to cheerleaders on other squads, only 2 of the squads had somebody who was willing to come forward.
Well, it's...
And listen, to the extent that what the change, if cheerleading is going to continue, the change that really needs to happen is that these women don't get paid minimum wage. They get paid commensurate with the kind of effort and skill it takes, whether you agree with it or not, that it takes to do what they do. And I think that that is a political statement, not so much a legal one. I mean, we can only get them so far legally, and then it's going to be up to them to unionize or do whatever political maneuvering they want to do. And I think what the Raiders and the other teams are relying on is that that's not going to happen.
Someone asked, what is the update on the Jill's case, if you know?
The case is, so the Jill's, the woman who actually ran the team, her company went bankrupt. So they ended up in bankruptcy. And then at the same time, the bills were sold to another group. So on top of the bankruptcy proceeding, there was a dispute about whether the claims transferred with the sale or not. So they were tied up in bankruptcy proceedings and agency arguments for 2 years. And now they're hoping to go forward, but that's the one case that hasn't been settled. I mean, nothing's happened. And as far as I know, the Bills still don't have a cheerleading squad.
It's been a few years then that they haven't had a cheerleader squad.
Right.
That, of course, which is further punishment on the women who were cheerleaders.
Of course.
Now, in the film, I thought this was interesting. Lacey had said that she supported herself through college by cheerleading because her college paid for this work. Why is there this pay disparity between college cheerleading and professional teams cheerleading?
I suspect some of it is the power of pro football. I mean, it's, you know, it's an incredibly a huge business. And truthfully, I don't know if it was true at every school that they paid their cheerleaders decently. It was where Lacey went to school, but we didn't do any investigation to see if college cheerleaders overall were paid accordingly.
Do you think perhaps Title IX made a difference because that was enacted back in 1972 and it required, male and female teams, including cheerleaders, to be treated the same way? Do you think perhaps early on that massive bill in education made a difference?
I suspect it gave some of the women leverage, but I'd be very, very surprised that the universities voluntarily decided to comply with Title IX, since they don't seem to in any other area which Title IX is applicable. They have to be pressured. So I don't know. It may have been certainly a lever that could have been used.
So we have another question. Are there any male cheerleaders who do an RBG style lawsuit?
There is one team that has male cheerleaders. The Ravens have, or at least have had, male cheerleaders. And I don't know whether they would come forward or not. I mean, one of the tricky things, and Darcy worked on this a lot when we were working on the briefing, is to make arguments so that the women were paid more than minimum wage. I mean, we had a lot of very clever ideas. Whether any of those ideas would have held water going forward, I don't really know. But the guy who is in the costume for the mascot, he's paid $60,000 a year. And the kid who's a bench warmer and is out on the practice field and never sees a minute of play, he's paid $100,000 a year. Okay, and all we could get legally is that the women were paid minimum wage, which is just ridiculous. So there's this whole question of whether the women's work, even by the time we were done, was truly being valued.
That is really unbelievable. I mean, probably people in the concession stands earn more than minimum wage at all the games.
And I think what goes without, which Sharon didn't explicitly say, but is part of it, is all the mascots are male, and the guys warming the bench they're all guys warming the bench. So you do have a serious gender disparity.
Well, this film certainly shined a light on women's work in general, but specifically on cheerleading, this huge multi-billion-dollar industry that has treated women so shabbily. Do you think that it's because cheerleading lacks a certain kind of societal respect that has been tolerated?
Well, I mean, I think generally when you look at women versus men, obviously women are paid less. When you look at, even within the same field, when you have women that are doing particular, like I just, the thing that comes to mind is, you think about chefs, for example, like, pastry chefs who are mostly women versus other chefs. Women are paid less in those fields a lot. So I just think women generally are paid less because I do think their work is valued less. And so it's really just, it's not unlike what you see every place else. And because it doesn't, football just exists in this society, and it's just a real kind of, I think, extreme example of some of the stuff you see elsewhere.
We also have another question. Good question. Can you imagine an NFL team free of sexism and racism? What changes would it take to get there?
Oh. Well, that's going to be hard for Sharon to answer because she saw her first football game in the middle of this case and had never seen one before.
I think change of leadership. You need to change the owners. I mean, really, and this isn't more about racism than it is about sexism, obviously, but when you look at what happened with Colin Kaepernick and the kneeling and the fact that these teams are owned by mostly white men who are penalizing, who were anyway, right? Because now they're all singing a different tune, or most of them are singing a different tune, but who are penalizing their African-American players who are earning money for them. The whole kind of, people called it sort of a plantation mentality, and I think that that's an accurate description. And so when you have people in charge of these teams who own these teams, who hold those viewpoints, then that kind of thing is going to persist. And I think, that's part of what needs to happen is because I think the idea that their attitudes are going to really change. I mean, frankly, what we've seen over the summer is because things, the Black Lives Matter movement and things blew up. And so it became, I think, just politically problematic to continue to hold the views that they were holding and to continue to try to penalize people for kneeling. And so I don't think that you can count on them. So really, I think a leadership change would be necessary.
And combined with a kind of a grassroots change, because I think that's how you saw some of the names changing, it was just not socially acceptable anymore to have some of the names of the teams the way they were. And there have been people trying to fight that in small groups here and there for years. For years, the Native Americans have been complaining about it, et cetera. And I think, again, it's that, law can only act as social change in a limited manner. Social change comes from social movements. And when social movements, and I think Darcy's right, when the leadership changes, or at minimum feels like they can't be public and take the actions they felt a sense of immunity in taking previously, things begin to change a little.
Well, and I just want to add on to that, because I think Leslie's right. And also, stop watching football. I mean, not enough people did it to make a difference, but I know a number of African-American men who just stopped watching football because of what was happening with Colin Kaepernick. And so that's a thing that people can do. I mean, they do this because they're still making money at it. And if they stop making money, even if they don't do it from the goodness of their hearts, they'll do it because of their wallet. So
also, when the players pull together, I mean, that makes a huge difference. Okay, so one of the problems for the cheerleaders is, even though there's a fellow in the film who talks about the players, not like the players stood up at the time and stood behind Lacey. Okay, it's not like the players at the time that Colin Kaepernick started kneeling all of a sudden said, "Oh my gosh, we're not going to play unless this changes." I mean, if you have the group congealing together, it makes a huge difference. I mean, look at what happened just recently in Georgia. Okay, Raphael Warnock got a huge boost because the female soccer team, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the team, but the team that's owned by Kelly Loeffler banded together and they started, supporting Warnock. So, I mean, when these groups band together for a particular cause, whether it's the women being, properly compensated, or Black Lives Matter, or trying to get rid of a senator that they think is a racist, I mean, that kind of collective action makes a huge difference.
We have another question. Is there a way to estimate the team's revenue that's attributed to cheerleaders? Was there a way to, an attempt to do that?
Oh, wait a second. I was just corrected. It's actually the basketball team in Georgia, not soccer. That shows that I know nothing about sports.
So do we know how cheerleaders how much of the revenue in football can be attributed to the work of cheerleaders?
I don't think we know across teams. I know, and I don't think we ever could quite figure that out with the Raiders. The Dallas Cowboys, apparently there's some information out there because they're kind of the best known cheerleading team in the league. I don't remember what the numbers were, but there was some ability to quantify that. Do you?
It was $1 million. They thought that the Dallas Cowboys cheerleaders brought in minimally $1 million just in the sales of calendars and cheerleader paraphernalia. We never got that information in our case.
Do you remember in the film with one of the Jills, and they had to raise money for the golf tournament, and she was in that cage and somebody threw a ball and then she fell into the water, and they had to sell their calendars in order to raise money for themselves. You know, when the team was a profit-making organization, it's just unbelievable, really.
Well, that's true of the Raiderettes too. They had to sell they had to pose for the calendars, they had to appear in the calendars, and then they had to sell a certain number of calendars. And if they didn't sell them, they had to keep them themselves.
So this has been such really a profound movie, whether or not whatever we thought of cheerleading, it has really changed. Anyone who's seen this movie, it changes your perspective about the dignity of the profession, about the work it takes to get there, and about the plight of women's work in general. Please give me your last thoughts about this.
You know, I think that speaking for myself, you know, it was a great case to work on because, you know, we had a lovely client. Lacey is just a great person. We were able to make a statement about women's work, about wage theft, about the NFL. And I think that it was one of those cases where our firm was able to live up to its ideals of trying to make the world a better place.
Darcy, Leslie?
I think ditto what Sharon said. It was just a great case to be involved in. I enjoyed doing it. It was legally interesting. The clients were great. It was a good case.
And the only thing I ditto all of that, but the only thing I would add is the moment in which Lacey said she was a feminist made it all worthwhile.
Well, it really changed her, and she really grew into the role of being, you know, someone who could speak up for herself and fight for what's right.
Well, also, I do want to say we were incredibly fortunate that, you know, a filmmaker became involved in this project and interested in the project. I mean, at the time that we were originally contacted, it was like the farthest thing from our mind that there would ever be a documentary about the film. And, you know, we worked with us all this time and did such an amazing job that, I mean, we feel, you know, so fortunate to have had this story told many times. I mean, certainly, you know, as a civil rights lawyer, it's not every day that you end up, you know, on PBS. So that was cool too. And you know, I think that it's also not just that it was fun for us, but I think that it's given people an opportunity to think about this case again in the lens of 2021, which is different than what happened in 2014.
Well, I want to thank our sponsors, Alameda County Bar Association, Women Lawyers of Alameda County, for bringing this program. The speakers, amazing speakers and lawyers. I want to thank Yugu for making the film, and most of all, the women who risked their careers to make a difference for cheerleaders in the NFL. This documentary, this movie is going to be available for pre-order on iTunes and Amazon. You can do that, the pre-order now, and it will be you can download it on the 26th of this month. So thank you so much for spending this evening with us. It's really been an enlightening discussion, an enlightening and powerful film. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Well, take care.